Hello, friends. This is the Netarts Friends Church podcast. We are Jesus people, Kingdom of God people, welcoming, yearning, sharing. And we're glad you're connecting here with us. We'd love to connect in person as well. If you're inclined to support this podcast or for more information, just hop on over to netartsfriends.org. That's netartsfriends.org. Let's jump into today's sermon. Fred and Tom. Fred and Tom were friends. Not dump your heart out, spill your guts friends. Just golfing buddies. Keep it light, hit a few balls, share some banter and some drinks, tell some funny stories. Those kinds of friends. Until Tom's septic system went kaput. The plumber couldn't put the new system in for 3 weeks, which meant that Tom needed a place to stay for 3 weeks. And Fred lightheartedly said, "Well, Tom, we've got an extra room in the basement. Why don't you just bunk in with our family for 3 weeks?" And that is how Tom came to see Fred in a whole new light. On the golf course, Fred was lighthearted and fun, but not in his marriage, and not with his kids, and not in his life. When Fred's kids poured milk on their cereal, Fred was right there criticizing them. "You're wasting milk. You don't need that much milk for that much cereal. Stop slouching. Sit up." Meanwhile, Fred's wife was in the living room folding laundry, and Fred said, "You're folding it wrong. I want the shirt sleeves tucked in first. Why aren't you over here sitting at the table with the family while we're eating?" Tom and Fred's offices were close to one another, so they carpooled. They stopped at the grocery store on the way and happened to watch someone not return their cart, and Fred began a long speech about grocery cart etiquette and how you can tell what kind of person someone is based on if they leave their cart out or if they push it in from a mile away without watching where it goes, or if they carefully and responsibly put it in the stack, not slamming it, but making sure it's in line. They pulled through the coffee drive-thru and Fred made a big show of putting a $5 bill in the tip jar. Tom said, "Hey, that was generous," which somehow morphed into a lecture about how you should never tip less than 20%, and if you do tip less than 20%, you aren't a good human, and how humanity is going down the tubes because people aren't committed to generosity, and a spiel about how Fred was an exemplary human because he made a practice of tipping at least 30%. And by the time Fred dropped Tom off, Tom was wondering if he'd made a mistake in planning to stay with Fred for 3 weeks. That evening, Fred scolded his children as soon as he walked in the house for the messy way they'd left their shoes scattered by the front door, and at dinner, Fred's son told a story about a boy who wore pajama pants to school, which prompted Fred to tell a corrective story about how his grandpa had always judged people for the way they dressed and how sloppy they looked, as if he was so much better than them. Fred went on and on with a speech about how we aren't going to be like Grandpa. We're not going to be judgmental like Grandpa, and how he judged everyone about their clothes and appearance. Fred's son looked like he wished he'd never opened his mouth. By the time dinner was over, Tom was happy to get away and settle down into a chair in the corner to read a book. Fred sat down next to him and picked up a magazine. From the kitchen, Fred's wife asked Tom what he was reading, and Tom held up the book for her to see. Tom knew it was a controversial book. He'd developed a practice of reading books written by people different than him. Books outside his comfort zone that challenged him to think. His bookshelf was littered with books written by people who probably disagreed with one another. Somehow holding up the book started Fred in on a tirade about which political camp this author or that author is in, and how that person isn't worth reading, and that person isn't worth your time, and that author shouldn't have ever been published, and they're conservative, and they're woke, and they're evangelical, and they're Eastern, labeling and censoring. And Fred went on and on until Tom said he needed to go to the bathroom. As Tom came out of the bathroom, Fred's oldest son was coming down the hallway, and in a hushed voice, he said, "You sure walked into that one. Don't even get him started on tax policy stuff unless you're ready to go down the rabbit hole that the algorithms are feeding him." Tom winked. "I won't." Tom sat down to read his book, and he observed Fred's children playing video games in the next room. He could hear Fred's oldest son going on and on, lecturing the younger siblings about the proper way to play the game and how they weren't doing it right. Day after day, week after week, Fred had so much to say about the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things. Fred seemed so thoroughly convinced that he was justified in every speech, in every correction, every comment. And the longer it went on, the more Tom's heart hurt for his friend, Fred, and for everyone around Fred. The time came for their weekly golf game. Tom was standing out in the parking lot putting on sunscreen when Fred started making fun of the way Tom was putting on sunscreen. Tom would have probably laughed it off before, but now it landed differently. Tom drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly, while Fred went on to explain that there are right and wrong ways to put on sunscreen. And they headed inside the clubhouse to get a drink before playing around. While they were sitting at the table, Tom said, "Hey, Fred, can I tell you a bit about me?" Fred blinked. "Sure." Tom started in. He said, "I used to correct the way my wife chopped the vegetables. I corrected the way she taught our kids to tie their shoes. Every day I scolded my kids for leaving the lights on. I was constantly correcting the way my wife said things. I was picky. I was obsessed about the way people did things wrong. I was critical. I was reactive. I categorized people. I thought I had them pegged. I tested them with my questions and my knowledge. And I let the algorithms take me down my own dark rabbit holes. Rather than reading broadly, I holed up in my own echo chamber and listened to one news station, one only. I took screenshots of my social media memes so I could remember them for later when I was arguing with people. I never listened to learn from other perspectives or read someone who might challenge me. I knew all the reasons that people different than me were wrong, and I made speeches. I had a million soapboxes: the right way to shuffle the cards, the right way to drive, the right way to make the bed, the right way to mow the lawn, the right way to load the dishwasher. I was a militant hawk when it came to my kids having table manners. I'm really good at website design, and sometimes I would volunteer and make websites for various nonprofits and charities, and I told myself I was being generous. But it wasn't because I wanted to help them or that I cared about helping their charitable cause. It was about me. I wanted the spotlight. When I went to dinner parties and people asked what I did for fun, I would show them the websites that I built for these charities as if I was some kind of Mother Teresa. And somehow I thought I was a really good guy. And I thought all my soapboxes were right. I was absolutely full of critiques and corrections for almost everyone, almost everything. Anytime my wife or kids tried to argue, I always made it about the content, and I knew that I could win every argument. I thought I was generous because I worked hard and was providing for my family. Guess what happened? One day my wife came to me and she told me that she was divorcing me. She said that I had just become impossible to live with and that my inner and outer world were not aligned. Fred, my kids told the judge that they want to live with their mom, that they don't want to live with me. And it shook me. It traumatized me. It rocked my world. I remember ending up in a Motel 6. I had no one to give my speeches to, no one left to correct. And I was looking for the TV remote and I pulled open a drawer by the bed and there was this Bible in there. I don't know why I picked it up, but I did. I flipped it open and I read a story about Jesus. And here, I'll read you the story that I read. And Tom opened up a Bible app on his phone. It's Luke 11. A Pharisee invited Jesus to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Then the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, because you're like unmarked graves which people walk over without knowing it. One of the experts in the law answered him, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also." Jesus replied, "And you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Because of this, God in his wisdom said, I'll send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill, and others they will persecute. Therefore this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. Woe to you, experts in the law, because you've taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering." When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. Tom finished reading the scripture and looked at Fred. That's the story I read that night, sitting there on the bed in the Motel 6, and I just stared at it. I felt like I was looking in a mirror, and the more I looked, the more I realized, this is me. And that moment really was the beginning of a journey of unlearning and relearning for me. It was the beginning of me realizing that I had become a right-aholic. That's what I call it. I was addicted to being right. And I saw myself in every part of that ancient story. I demanded things of people, that they think and act and behave in certain ways, but I would never allow them to make the same kind of demands of me or treat me with so much scrutiny. I drew boundaries and categorized people, thought I had them pegged, and all my generosity was for show. It was a ploy to get the spotlight. I wasn't actually generous to hardly anyone. I didn't let anyone get away with anything. I made sure everyone knew that they owed me. I told myself I was working hard for my family, but I was making life harder for everyone around me, and I rarely lifted a finger to help them. My inner and my outer worlds were not in alignment. In my entire life, I'd never wanted to admit anything that I wasn't forced to admit, even to myself. I thought it was my duty to interpret reality for everyone else and to tell them the will of God, as it were, the right way to mow the lawn, or whatever it was. And up to that point, I'd spent my entire career working in the judicial system with people who I thought of as villains and addicts, abusers, emotionally unstable. I told myself all the time, I'm different than them. And I hadn't realized that many of the same unhealthy patterns I was actually perpetuating in my own life, my own marriage, my own family. I sat there reading this ancient story of these Pharisees and these experts in the law and realized I'm in that same pattern. I'm in the same ugly cycle as these guys that Jesus had lunch with. And I realized you can do the same thing that these guys were doing with religion, with pretty much any topic under the sun. Making the bed, mowing the lawn, politics, leaving lights on in the house, all of it. I thought back to my own ancestors. Jesus had talked to them about their ancestors. I thought about how I always complained about my dad being the grammar police in our family and how rude he was around efficiency with time and how mean he could be when he found out that my wife and I sometimes used paper plates and didn't compost. And I had told myself I wasn't ever going to do that. And I never have. I don't correct people's grammar. I don't give them a hard time for being late. I don't correct them for using paper plates. But I realized as I sat there on the bed reading the Bible, I was missing the forest for the trees because the content of the arguments might be different, but there was a process, there was a pattern that was the same. I was responsible for perpetuating the pattern of having to be right and the pattern of policing everyone else in my family in a way that was oppressive. I was repeating that same pattern that had been present within my family, and I was passing it on to my kids. I was rubbing off on my kids and on the people around me. Jesus talks about these unmarked graves. The whole deal with graves in the ancient world was people thought that they make you unclean. An unmarked grave would make you dirty and you wouldn't even realize it. And I realized that's happening with me all the time. All of my aholic stuff is rubbing off on our kids without them even realizing it. And our kids are giving one another speeches about the right way to play basketball. And they're criticizing what movies the other one likes. And I realized that's coming from me. That's rubbing off. I spent at least the next year meditating on these words of Jesus and thinking about them almost every day. And I realized that we all want to tell ourselves that we're not responsible for the sins of our ancestors. We want to tell ourselves that we aren't perpetuating the same patterns. We want to say, if I lived back then, I would have been on the right side of history. The Pharisees said to Jesus, they would never have killed the prophets. But Jesus Jeremiah'd them, as it were, And their next move was they're ready to plot to kill him. We're all addicted to thinking we're right, even when we're wrong. Well, Tom stopped there. Fred was just staring out the window. Staring. Tom said, "I'm sorry. I don't think any of that came out right. I probably shouldn't have said any of it. I'm sorry. It's just that when I see you go on and on about the milk and the cereal and the shoes by the door and the way the laundry's folded and the grocery cart etiquette and pegging everyone and the sunscreen, Fred, I've been down that road. And if someone had pulled me up short, if they had said, 'Whoa there, whoa,' maybe I wouldn't have heard it. But I really wish they would have tried, because I know what it's possible to lose. Fred, I don't want you to lose your marriage or your kids. I don't want you to make life harder for yourself and for everyone around you. And if you're like me, somewhere under all of that trying to be right, you're suffering." Fred took a drink of his water. He stared out the window. It was like he was looking at his life. He didn't look mad. He looked stunned. He looked lost. And he said, "What do I do?" Tom said, "That might be a question you need to ask Jesus. I can tell you how it went for me. For a time, I went through a deep depression. I heard Jesus's woes almost like a club or a curse. That scripture that had woken me up, I heard it as if it was beating me over the head. And I thought I was suffering the punishment, losing my wife, losing my family, losing my home. I couldn't see my way out of my addiction to being right. I still wanted someone to give my speeches to. I tried to find people to give my speeches to. It was like I was addicted to that ancient fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But then one day I was reading that passage in Luke 11, and I heard what Jesus was saying in a fresh way. I noticed that before speaking any woes, Jesus invited the Pharisees to be generous, to give, to be generous with the things among them, with their material and social resources. And that was the antidote to their greed. That was the antidote to their problem. And I wondered what would happen if I listened for Jesus speaking this whole conversation as a blessing. I realized there's a blessing here. It's not just woe. Maybe the opposite action is the antidote. Maybe the woe isn't a punishment. Maybe it's more like a woe that you say to a horse, just trying to slow it down before it goes off the cliff. So I tried to listen for the blessing. I still remember the first day I asked Jesus that question, and I felt like I could hear the answer. Blessed are you when your inner and your outer life are aligned. Blessed are you when you treat yourself well and treat others well. When you aren't nitpicky. When you aren't nitpicky and obsessed with the sins of others. When you're consistent with your own life. Blessed are you when your generosity isn't just a game or a scheme to gain the spotlight. When you look for ways to greet people who are lonely, to honor people who are overlooked. Blessed are you when your generosity creates room for the people around you, giving them space to breathe, to be themselves, to get it wrong. When you aren't pegging anyone, when you aren't categorizing and criticizing anyone. Blessed are you when you have an eye out for people who are struggling, when you care about real justice, delivering the oppressed, when you desire to help, when your desire for justice, your love for humanity is tied up with your love for God. Blessed are you when you are like unmarked springs of fresh water, when other people are blessed by being around you and you didn't even realize it. It was accidental, when your generosity and your goodness just rubs off on them. Blessed are you when you make life easier for other people, not harder. When you ease their burdens, when you help them carry their load, instead of correcting them and how they put the groceries in the bag the right way, you help them carry the groceries into the house and put them away. Blessed are you when you face the sins of your ancestors, the unhealthy patterns in the generations that came before you, and you own them as your own sins. When you take responsibility for how you have repeated and perpetuated those unhealthy patterns, blessed are you when you begin the journey with God's help of changing those patterns. Blessed are you when you celebrate the learning journey of others. Blessed are you when you become a person on a learning journey, letting Jesus be your teacher. Blessed are you when you recognize that all of your labeling and censoring and withholding the keys of knowledge was only hurting you. You are blessed as you find that there's something you can learn from everyone, even your critics, even those you disagree with, even those different than you, even your children. There's something of God in every human, something you can learn if you're willing to listen. Fred, I heard Jesus saying to me, "Let me be your teacher." And Fred, I have found something in Jesus of Nazareth that I've not been able to find anywhere else. Tom paused there. He said, I don't know if that really answers your question, what do I do? I do think that's a question you need to ask Jesus. All I know is that when I could finally accept that my name is Tom and I'm a aholic, but I have a teacher and his name is Jesus and he's teaching me the way of blessedness. Somehow that way of blessedness eased those aholic impulses. And sure, they come up from time to time. Sometimes I fall off the wagon. Sometimes I find myself in the middle of a speech about the right way to chop vegetables. And I think, what am I doing? But I no longer feel stuck. I don't think God's punishing me. The blessing is where it's at. And it's the heart of Jesus. It's where the life is at. Fred stared out the window and let out a long, slow breath. He looked up at the clock and said, "I don't think we're going to play our golf game today, but that's okay." And a tear formed in his eye and he said, "Thanks, Tom. I am reeling. I need to sit with this, but thanks." And Tom patted Fred's shoulder and he walked out. And Fred sat there at that table for a very long time. 3 weeks later, Tom pulled up at the golf course. His plumbing work was all done. He was back in his own house, and there was Fred pulling out his clubs. Tom asked Fred if he wanted to go grab a drink before the game. Sure. So they sat down, and Tom said, "How are you doing?" Fred said, "I am a person on a journey, and it's a long journey. I have a lot of unlearning to do, a lot of patterns to change. But you know what's crazy? Is how good it feels to find some alignment between my inner and my outer world, the inside of the dish and the outside of the dish. One part of me still wants to correct everyone, but that other part, walking that path of blessing, it's like I used to be driving down the road out of alignment and I was just wearing my tires down to shreds. And now I'm finding some alignment and life feels so good. Wow. Who knew? So I want to bring one more person into the conversation. And that's you. If Jesus is holding up the mirror to you, in what way do you say, "That's me"? And it might not be about religion or how to load the dishwasher, but how do you see yourself in this gospel story? How do you say, "I am repeating that same ancient pattern with my own subject matter"? And what does it mean for you to face that? To own it? To start the journey on the path of blessedness? What does it mean to live with the generosity, financial generosity, emotional generosity, relational generosity, social generosity, physical generosity towards others? The thing that Jesus says will make everything clean. The thing that causes your inner world and your outer world to be aligned. So I want to invite you to do some form of what we did in our gathered worship time. In some way, it's sitting in the clubhouse and staring out the window and asking Jesus the question for yourself. What do I do? And the way we went about that was not only listening, but also doing some writing. If you turn that passage in Luke 11 into a blessing, can you hear what Jesus is saying to you? What is the path of blessing for you? Thank you for joining us for a Sunday sermon from Netart's Friends Church. We hope you'll join us soon for one of our in-person worship gatherings. For more information, hop on over to netartsfriends.org. God's peace be with you, friends.